Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa and the world's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. In this show, we gather a panel of brilliant South Africans who live scattered around the world to discuss the most important South African and global news stories and ideas of the week. What a show we have ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about the Iranian boat in Simonstown, foot and mouth disease, matric maths results, growth opportunities in Africa, Germany getting less green, global oil outlook, ice in Minnesota, ANC below 50%, and the NPA. But before we get to all of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans from across the globe. Joining us from Germany, where we see him negotiating on 5 conflicts all at once, he is the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Steve Witkoff of the Visa, James Myberg. From Germany, we are off to the United Kingdom, where we find our UK correspondent giving his soldiers a sneaky feel to check they aren't trans. He is the Pete Hegseth of Hammersmith, Simon Lincoln Reader. And from the UK, we head down to South Africa, where we are joined by our guest for this week's episode, giving us all a proud Arkansas yeehaw. He is the director of the Middle East Africa Research Group, the Mike Huckabee of Houghton, Benji Shulman. And continuing in South Africa, from where we are joined by the Common Sense's editor, who is doing a celebratory dance. He is the founder of Frans Private Clients, the Donald Trump of the Transvaal, Frans. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, starting from very humble beginnings, the J.D. Vance of Johannesburg, Gabriel Makin. As I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very jam-packed show today, and we will be starting off with our guest, Benji, who's going to tell us about the Iranian boat that has been in Simonstown doing naval exercises with the South Africans. So Benji, can you just tell us about what's going on here?
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. Great to be here, and great podcast. I'm a regular watcher. A bit of background on this. So South Africa regularly does naval exercises with a range of different countries, and in the last 5 or 6 years, they've done something they were calling MOSI, which I think means smoke in Tswana. And typically these exercises were done with Russia and China. There was one that was done in 2019. It didn't attract much attention. And then the MOSI 2 got a lot of attention because it was done on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that caused some consternation with the Americans, and there was a few issues that went on around it. And now this exercise is being done. It's actually Chinese-led. So it is called the Will to Peace exercise. And for the first time, what we're seeing is that it's kind of being branded as a BRICS exercise, which is kind of interesting because BRICS is not supposed to be a military alliance, it's more of an economic one, but it's sort of branded as a mixed, a BRICS alliance issue, and it's being really driven by the Chinese. And for the first time, what we're seeing is the active involvement of the Iranians. Now, it's not the first time that South Africa has been involved with naval exercises with Iran. We've acted as observers in other naval exercises that involved Russia and China and Iran, but we didn't send any boats. But this is the first time that we see actually Iran and South Africa in the same in the same place with the same ships. And we have now not 1, 2, actually 3 Iranian ships docked in Simonstown Harbor, and this has sparked off a bunch of very interesting dynamics. The one has been that the South Africans seem to have become nervous about the fact that the Iranians were there just as a sort of another uprising against the regime, more protests, and so you have this very disconcerting image of Iranian ships, which are not actually all of them from the Iranian army itself. They're actually connected to the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is sort of the shock troops of the regime. It's not the normal army. And so this ship is there, which really makes a big point. You've got this really unprecedented set of protests. And then on top of that, we had a vote this week in the States on AGOA. and and that seems to have made the South Africans quite nervous. So they issued a statement saying that the Iranians were not involved, or I'm not sure if there was a statement, but there was a sense in which they were not involved. And then, as reported on this outlet and a number of others, we suddenly see that they were. So there's now a question of, well, was this not communicated properly? Was it just intentionally ignored? Is it just an obfuscation thing? But the point is that for a week now, we've had these Iranian vessels in the country whilst the Iranian regime cracks down on protesters in the thousands, even by the regime's own estimates, and so it's caused something of a diplomatic headache for the South Africans, and clearly the left hand not speaking to the right hand, or deliberately so.
Yeah, so I think just something to quickly unpack about what you said is you mentioned that the IRGC are kind of the shock troops of Iran, but they're not the army. Could you make that difference for us kind of more clear? And would it be therefore more significant that it's an IRGC boat, or would it be more significant if it was part of the Iranian army?
So, at the risk of violating Godwin's law, I'll use a quick Nazi analogy. But you had in Germany, you had the Wehrmacht, which was the German army, and then you had the SS, which was sort of the Nazi troops that were connected directly to the Nazi party and Hitler's regime. And the IRGC is a similar kind of thing. It's a group of soldiers, but also it's very connected into the commercial aspects of the Iranian regime, and it's highly ideological, and it's connected to the Ayatollah's sort of Islamist agenda uh, in the state, and it's often much more resourced and better resourced than the army itself in some respects. So basically, they sent an ideological boat to Simonstown, and that I think carries more weight than if it was just your standard Iranian army war vessel.
I'll actually just ask Benji a question that you've written before on, and you seem to be quite expert on a history that actually goes back quite a long way of a relationship between Iran, the ANC leadership, and South African foreign policy. And I'm not sure putting you on the spot here on that, but it might be very interesting for people to hear some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Frans. Appreciate that. So the Iranians are an interesting case in the South African context, basically under apartheid from 1979. So this was after the revolution. Before then, Iran had been a pretty staunch supporter of apartheid in the sense that it sold oil to the apartheid government. And then you have the revolution and the Ayatollahs take over. And they are very staunchly opposed to apartheid, at least in rhetoric, and most importantly, in that they support the liberation movements, the PAC, the ANC, others that are involved in fighting the regime, and they're very loud about it. But at the same time, they were also doing deals behind the scenes, oil for weapons deals in the hundreds of millions of dollars at the same time, mostly because they had just been invaded by Iraq. And they needed weapons. So they were prepared to put their ideology aside. But what it meant was, as far as the ANC was concerned, after 94, this was an ally that had supported them in the struggle and supported them not just rhetorically, but financially, which is important for the ANC, particularly after 94, where they lose their funding from the Soviets and the Scandinavian countries. And so very quickly, South Africa as a country establishes a relationship with Iran. But what's interesting about it is that it doesn't really yield all that much economically. If you look at the amount of trade that we do with the Iranians, it's minuscule. It's not within our top 30 or maybe even 40 trading partners. Thailand trades more than with us. Mozambique, Israel even trades more than with the Iranians. And there's no real strategic value to our relationship with the Iranians either. The oil that they used to provide is provided by a lot of different countries. So what you have is an interesting situation where there's no important economic benefits to this relationship. There's no important strategic benefits to this relationship. But we have a really, really close relationship with the Iranians at a state level. And that is driven primarily by the ANC because of, first of all, ideology. They see Iran as an important actor sort of undermining Western influence in the global system of governance. And also there's a lot of engagement at the party level. So sort of the big thing that might actually come out this year is that there's a court case currently being run against MTN in South Africa, and there's a decision about if the Constitutional Court will allow it to go ahead from a jurisdictional question. But basically, that whole court case revolves around the fact that MTN got a license in Iran, and the allegation from Turkcell, which was its competitor, was that this was somehow done corruptly and done for foreign policy votes on their nuclear weapons program. And this thing has been bouncing around for about 10 years. And now there's a question about this year about if we might actually see a court case that questions the legalities around how that license was awarded. And it has real implications because Iran is still invested in Iran. MTN, rather, is still invested in Iran with IRGC companies. So the holding company, Irancell, one side of the transaction are companies connected to the IRGC. The other one is MTN, of which it's a minority shareholder, but still a shareholder nonetheless. And this is the company that's turning off the internet in these protests at the moment that is now, I think like 180 hours as we speak on this podcast. And so that puts MTN in a quite a lot of crosshairs on this issue, and also the Americans, who have now started to look at various legal and legislative actions against them as well. The person who was the chairman of MTN when the deal was done was now President Cyril Ramaphosa. So you can see the corporate ANC links in how the foreign policy operates on them.
Frans?
Just suggested something. That James, a year or two ago, did some really interesting writing on South Africa's foreign policy of the last 30 years. Finding that, and James must say if this is right now, but that often where a foreign policy position was explained as a South African foreign policy position, explained as having its roots in historical loyalties to the struggle, there was actually also another dynamic, and that was the flow of money. And some of the theory of people who think about South Africa's Iran relationship, given that the liberation movement ties are a little bit tenuous, because the Iranians were major weapons buyers from the South Africans and sent them lots of oil, the apartheid South Africans, is that in fact it's the nub of the thing, if you want to get to it, is perhaps starts with looking at that MTN transaction in 2000 and when was it? 2004, I think, Benji.
Yeah, I think that's correct. For James to just follow up on that, I think give a couple of examples of that, James. It's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think one thing to remember about Iran, another sort of nuance, is that I can't remember its name, but there was a sort of communist party in Iran that the ANC and South African Communist Party were allied with, and that was part of the revolution. And I think very soon after the mullahs took over, they sort of basically crushed that party. And so the links actually, the mullahs weren't really in the Soviet camp at all. They just crushed the Soviet sort of party in Iran. So that's another complication. The ANC always sort of attributed, its foreign policy relations to historical loyalty, and with the exception of Cuba, I think most of the time it's often very tenuous. I mean, the main sponsors were the Soviets, but the relationship with Russia broke down in the early 90s. Obviously, many of the regimes in Eastern Europe no longer existed that had sponsored the ANC. The Swedes were the major sponsors in the early 90s. And these relations, including with Gaddafi, and then later Saddam Hussein for a while, and then Iran later, were much more transactional than people think. And that relationship with Iran was forged in the early 2000s, where Iran was pushing its nuclear starting to push its nuclear program. There was a big pushback from the West, which was then trying to isolate Iran. And the ANC sort of stepped in and sort of offered, I think, various services to the Iranian government, particularly diplomatic protection in the UN and the AU, where the government was very influential. And I think that and then the quid pro quo would have been the Iran cell deal for MTN, and MTN as a company always had very close from its found very soon after its founding, it always had a very close links to the ANC. So I think that's how I would see the relationship, as not one of great historical loyalty, but rather of sort of mutual interests between the ANC government and the Iranians, but not national interests at all from the South African side.
And I mean, that's exactly the thing, because very often when something happens like the events of this last week, these naval exercises, the explanation that especially Western observers kind of clutch at is oh well, this is just the old historical loyalties. But if you scratch a bit at the surface of those explanations, very seldom do they actually hold up. And more often than not, you find other relationships that do a better job of explaining. Just one more thing I want to ask Benji is, I mean, by necessity, one must speak this way, the ANC and Iran. But my impression, formed over the last few months, is that at the very least, the ANC is not united in its position of backing Iran. And I think there are quite a few senior ANC people who are increasingly uncomfortable with this association. What would you say to that?
So I think that there's merit to that. The big thing I think is that DIRCO is really run by people who were put there by Pandor, who were even had previous links to South African ANC governance, and I think really those guys are driving this very strong Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever type foreign policy approach that we're seeing. The current minister, Ronald Lamola, is he's a kind of dyed in the wool ANC type. He's young, but he doesn't really deviate too much from the generalized public party line. And I think more importantly than anything else, he does what Cyril Ramaphosa tells him to do, which I think is the main qualification if you want to be the DIRCO minister in this particular government. But I do think that what we've seen in the last, even under the Biden regime, but certainly amongst Trump, is that the ANC is looking at the way that the Americans are talking. They understand that there's serious economic implications, potentially serious personal implications. Some of these bills that we're seeing being run through Congress at the moment, the AGOA question, but there's more to than that. You know, they're talking about a full review of South Africa, American ties. And I think that the ANC feels like they could be at personal risk, but I also think that they sort of understand that if they're trying to balance off or at least take the American money without necessarily getting involved with the American politics, that this is going to complicate themselves. So I think that there probably is inside the ANC a group who would like to be more pragmatic, if you like, on this issue, but they're not in control of DIRCO, and that's I think where a lot of this is being driven from.
My impression of it is that if the Iran issue could be dealt with on South Africa, then enormous amount of progress would have been made towards normalizing relations with the US. It's sort of hard to do these things, but I'd say that at least half the problem arises from the Iran tie, and deal with that issue, and the way forward for SA-US relations becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The Americans have tended to be, if you like, understanding of the big power competition, what the role that the Russians or the Chinese play, but they don't like it when you start associating with these smaller states. The other one is Venezuela, where the ANC has strong ties as well, and Iran has implications for all sorts of things, not just the America-Israel relationship, but also the America-Saudi relationship. what their interests are in Lebanon, in Syria, really all over the Gulf, Qatar, the UAE. And so the Iranians are particularly annoying for the Americans. And don't forget, for a certain generation of Americans, people like Donald Trump, they were alive when they had these images of Jimmy Carter and failed desert raids and the embassy being taken over during the revolution. And that's really sticks, I think, in the American mind. If you look, there's an old sign that you can see in if you Google it, it's called "Fight Back, Drive 55," and there's a big picture of the Ayatollah's face on that on that sign, and it's a sign from that period, which was Americans who were angry about the cost that the economy was taking because of the oil embargoes and all of this, and so we sort of encouraged to drive more slowly to fight back against the Ayatollahs. And so for a certain kind of American who is very much still in power in Congress and Senate, that's the image of these guys, and that's the people who we're associating.
James?
I can tell you, sorry,
No, go ahead.
I can tell you that earlier this week, the South Africans put out a statement on the protests in Iran, a kind of very weak statement. It said that the army should show restraint in shooting the protesters, and also that the protesters should show restraint in how it confronts the army, which wasn't how the liberation movements framed their response to Sharpeville and Soweto in 1976. But I can tell you that that statement was read in Washington, obviously, and that some serious Americans were impressed. No, not fully impressed, but felt maybe this is at least there's a criticism of the Iranian regime. I thought maybe this is a start towards things. So I think if you're a senior South African policymaker, there's a lesson in that. These little signals are picked up, and if they become many signals, we can resolve the Iran issue. We're well on our way to sorting out things with the Americans as well. Sorry, Gabriel, I interrupted. You were going to let James say something.
Yeah. James?
How easy would it be, though, for the ANC to extricate itself from that Iran relationship, given potentially what was going on behind the scenes and what was being offered to the ANC and what the ANC governments have provided to Iran?
Well, I think easy, because I don't think much was offered to the ANC. And if it was, it would have been former officials, and it's a very tight circle of a small number of officials at most, and individuals even beyond the ANC. And I would guess here, and I am guessing, that if a future ANC leadership said, hey, listen, we get it, why this is a concern for you, and we're going to dial down this relationship completely and the ties around it, that would be welcomed in Washington. And Washington might be able to go along with the idea that this was a former generation, a small circle within that generation, and they no longer call the shots around South Africa's foreign policy. And that would be perfectly okay, is my guess of how the Americans would respond.
But then how would the Iranians respond if there was an actual sort of betrayal?
Well, yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's the thing I suppose the South African side has to weigh up. Is there a risk of exposure or so? I suppose the Iranians also might have limited options. What are they going to do? Come clean on whatever? And it's quite well documented, the sort of malfeasance that's gone on in the background. And also it depends who's in charge of Iran as this happens. The parts of the current, I don't think there's much appetite for in the Middle East or in the US for overthrowing the regime. I think the appetite rather is to see whether there can be a reordering of the regime through parts of the military, or perhaps a new kind of religious leadership, one less committed to nuclear weapons and the destruction of Israel. And so, depending on where these protests go and how this all plays out, key figures in the leadership that had been central to the South African relationship might also find themselves isolated or out of a job. And I think a very instructive thing for the South Africans to look at is how America has dealt with Venezuela. They've not installed the exiled opposition leader with the Nobel Prize and all the rest, who's a very open supporter, a generous one of Donald Trump. They've put Maduro's deputy in charge, who's, and ideologically and in many respects not far off what he was. But I'd imagine that terms were put to her, Rodriguez, and she was told, listen here, it's a hell of a hard thing to overthrow your entire regime and install a whole new government. So we'll cut the head off, give you a shot. But listen, distance from Iran, because that was one of the issues in Venezuela as well. And let's sort out your oil and stabilize your economy again. And if you can deliver that, we're happy. So this is not regime change in the way that some anti-Western actors have previously imagined regime change to be. This is in some respects regime maintenance, but with conditions. Conditions that thus far Rodriguez in Venezuela has appeared to live up to. And I'm certain, guessing again, that a similar offer has been put to the Iranians to say, listen, overthrow the worst of your administration, stop this Israeli stuff, stop the nuclear stuff, and we can do business and we can do a deal. This isn't an attempt to install a liberal administration. This is an attempt to restore order and secure core Western and American strategic interests. And I would further guess, again, that the US would handle South Africa in the same way, meaning that the ANC does not have to fear a threat of some kind of regime change to install an entire new administration. But rather, again, here's some advice to the South Africans. Listen to the core issues that the Americans are raising. See whether you can meet many of those, which you can with very little to no domestic downside. And then you can do business together and stay in power and be successful.
So I'm going to get the last two comments on this. Simon, to you first, and then we'll end with you, Benji.
Yeah, Benji, I think there's some precedent here. We're still very clear in our minds about the events of January the 2nd, 2020, and in the Iranians' minds. And I'll just give you a bit of a lead up to that. In the UK, through that November and December, there are a whole lot of podcasts and BBC documentaries that go out identifying who these people in the media establishment complex qualify as the strongest individual in Iran, and his name is Qasem Soleimani. And Trump is hearing this, and they're all going, "Well, this guy is so dangerous, and he's going to lead this Middle East resistance against the West, and so on." And then Trump just chopper bombed him very quickly, very efficiently. London was absolutely distraught. I think people were calling in to take time off work, but the reality is that all Iranians saw how quickly that happened and how effectively it happened, without much international condemnation. So I'm sure that is still very much in the minds of everyone there.
Benji?
I agree, Simon. I think that was the first instance, and it was actually kind of Venezuela-esque, the way that Trump handled Maduro in a kind of a similar way. The last part, which I just wanted to highlight, was just another local dynamic which has been picked up, is the role that Starlink is playing in some of this stuff. So in Uganda, we're seeing a shutdown of the internet, again, MTN, at the same time. But the few images and videos that we're getting out of Iran is coming from Starlink. And when you look on the social media chatter about the opposition to Starlink in South Africa, it's this idea that we're eroding sovereignty of South Africa. But I think what it actually points to is precisely opposite, is that Starlink would represent a lack of control for for media interests in this country, and I think that it's demonstrating that very effectively in the Iranian element here, and I think it's part of the discussion around where this might go in as the Starlink debate carries on in South Africa.
I think that that's an excellent place to leave this discussion. And we're going to stay on the theme of South Africa, where Frans is going to hopefully give us a bit of a shorter explanation on for this story on the foot and mouth disease that is ravaging the country at the moment.
Right, yeah. Foot and mouth disease is a viral disease that affects animals. It's a very devastating disease. In cattle, for example, they run a high temperature. The blisters form around the mouth. The skin around the tongue can come off. The hooves develop sores and ulcers, and in extreme cases can fall off, leaving an animal in absolute agony where it can't move and can't eat at the same time. Udders can become blocked, essentially, and the cows can't be milked out to bring them relief. The udder could burst if it's not milked out because the skin will come off the teats. So it's a very terrible disease. Historically, foot and mouth disease in South Africa was kept in a control zone in the north of the country, in a small little zone in the north where it was endemic to buffalo. And there were movement controls and other controls enforced by state veterinary services that sometimes a fence, literally, and some other measures that prevented the disease moving southwards. But over the last 20 years, those controls were allowed to collapse. The fence in practice fell over. And cattle that had been in the northern control zone were allowed to move into the south of the country. And outbreaks of the disease began to occur at a growing frequency in southern parts of South Africa. The situation in the present has become wholly out of control. And there are significant outbreaks of disease now across the majority of the country's provinces, including in places where it had never occurred before. The disease is something called a state control disease, and there are many kinds of these. And what that in practice means, and very specifically in this case, is only the state may respond to or treat or handle the disease. And there are historically good reasons for that. One is the state had the ability to do that. Secondly, it's an extremely serious disease. And thirdly, it's a disease that is on the global agenda as something that must be stopped from moving around countries and the like. So private actors cannot respond or treat or vaccinate as they choose to. In fact, doing many of those things is an offense that could see you being prosecuted. Now, the state's protocols, which were developed 30 and 40 years and even before that to deal with foot and mouth outbreaks, are quarantine and containment. So in the freak occurrence where a fleck of disease might be found in a spot outside of the historical northern control zone, what would in practice happen is state veterinary services would descend on that area. They would quarantine the businesses or farms in question and perhaps a zone around that. And they would move in and decide how to treat the outbreak, whether by culling or vaccination or containment or whatever the story was. And quarantine zones would in practice be restricted to where they couldn't trade or move animals around. It's a bit more complicated than that, but for the layperson, this suffices. Which was perfectly workable when there was a freak outbreak somewhere You control the small zone and you deal with the consequences. But that same protocol is now being applied to a national outbreak. So you're quarantining in increasingly expansive swathes of the country and preventing a normal trade in animals. If this persists, it will become a problem because cash flows are going to be put under pressure. This is the next phase, perhaps, of this problem. And then let me just go back one step. This issue has very recently come on the agenda of people beyond those who think about agriculture and farming. And it is appearing on the agendas now of people who think about stability and state security. And the reasons are this. If the quarantine strategy persists, and it can take up to a year to follow the protocols to get unquarantined again, and the cash flows are cut off to these businesses, more and more rural businesses are going to begin to default on their loans. And this is going to start becoming a crisis for financial institutions. At the same time, those businesses will begin to retrench staff. So rare rural jobs will begin to be lost in poverty-struck rural areas. At a time when, we'll get to this later in the show, the ANC is now polling at below 50% even in rural areas. Because the supply of products into the domestic market will be diminished, prices will increase. And when prices increase, food price inflation has a very clear relationship, established relationship to large-scale political instability in the country, large urban protests, xenophobic protests, always, where very often there's an early warning sign in food price inflation. So this will begin to occur. South African retailers who, entrepreneurs and ahead of the curve and are seeing where things are going, are already starting to look at their import options to make sure shelves are stocked. Now, if that occurs, South African domestic producers will begin to lose access to their own domestic market on questions of meat and dairy products and the like. And the products, the milk or the meat of an animal that was infected with foot and mouth disease is perfectly safe for human consumption. But the horrific nature of the disease, as I've described, is one that will be off-putting to domestic consumers. And once the pandemic resolves itself, it should do that, the outbreaks, South African domestic consumers are going to have a fight on their hands to get back into their own domestic market. They'll have to compete on price. They're going to be squeezed even tighter on questions of margins. And then there's the point that about a third of all the cattle in the country are owned by relatively poor rural people. That should well be over a third. But let's say informally owned. So the commercial farming industry has got about 70%, and let's say the emerging farmers, the rural poor, have about 30%. Now, animals that are exposed to this disease get through it and survive it where they are in very good condition, have access to excellent nutrition and very expert veterinary care, very expensive care that can nurse them through it, whether by antibiotics or anti-inflammatories and various other things. Now, the 30% of cattle that sit in poor communities do not have access to those resources because they're very expensive, and state veterinary services has completely collapsed. And the risk, therefore, is that those cattle will begin to die in disproportionate numbers. Because remember, the poor animal can't eat easily, and especially as winter comes now into South Africa, and the nutrition of the veldt diminishes. The risk is that large numbers of those cattle begin to die. And that eradicates much of the capital base of poor rural people and will make them terribly angry. So you can begin to see why national security analysts are starting to think about this over the heads of the sort of agricultural policy people who have their own concerns to worry about. A view that's increasingly developing is that the only way out of this is mass vaccination. However, because of the nature of how the state controls this disease, it is an offense for a private person to source or procure or administer vaccines. And the state has to do this. But the South African state has, for essentially the past 2 decades, failed in a global treaty obligation to submit samples of these diseases to the Piermont Institute, which is in Europe and is the central hub from which research into these terrible diseases occurs. And therefore, it's not entirely clear at the moment what South Africa is facing in terms of the disease, the specific nature of it. And buying off-the-shelf vaccines may therefore not be effective. And indeed, some of the feedback on the ground is that the vaccines that have been administered have not worked in some cases. So that must be fixed. After that's fixed, it must be borne in mind that the state once had, the South African state, a very powerful and effective vaccine manufacture capacities, but that capacity has collapsed because of corruption and mismanagement. The record around a particular group called Onderstepoort Biological Products, which had collapsed into complete chaos at one stage, shows that the state can no longer manufacture. So, if the solution is widespread vaccination, we're not clear exactly what we're dealing with here in terms of the nature of the disease, and the state's capacity to manufacture isn't there, and procuring off the shelf doesn't work. The scale at which the vaccination would have to occur is also something that rivals the COVID pandemic. It's not a question necessarily of giving an animal a shot and then it's in the clear. 3 monthly boosters may be necessary in many cases. And if estimates of the number of cattle in the country are correct, the need may be for something approaching 100 million doses of vaccine to be administered. Now, to make this more complicated, state vets have to deal with this, but part of the protocols are that a vet or state official who's been in contact with a positive case has to self-isolate, not to spread that case further, which is sensible. And again, worked 30 years ago if there was one community that had an outbreak. But now it means that the state's already diminished veterinary resources are being further diminished because staff who've been in contact with positive cases have to go into isolation and therefore aren't available to deal with the next cases. The sense of the thing, therefore, is that the solution at this point is a regulatory change to allow private actors, entrepreneurs, the industry to source and procure its own vaccines, subject, of course, to sensible government regulation. And that short of that, this disease cannot be reined in. It is in practice no longer a state-controlled disease because the state has in practice lost control of it. Firstly, out of the exclusion, out of the containment zone, now across the country, and the protocols don't apply. And indeed, if these protocols continue to be enforced, the broader economic and political and instability risks that they trigger are existential to the country. So, Gabriel, that was the shortest briefing I could give you on the foot and mouth outbreak and its implications and what may have to be done in order to rein it in.
Thank you very much, Frans. I did not intend to offend at all. I just need to get through we need to get through at a clop now the incredible rest of the show. But I do have one quick follow-up question on what you were saying there, Frans, which is, we've got the agricultural ministry is one of the ministries that has fallen outside of ANC control in this new government. So how much of the problem can be attributed to the failures of previous governments, and how much of this problem has been exacerbated by the current leadership in the agricultural ministry?
Well, Gabriel, as you know, our show has the reputation for being the standout defender of John Steenhuisen and happens to be the minister. Now, I mean, this problem was inherited by John and his administration due to years of neglect, from letting the containment zones go to the collapse of the vaccine manufacturing capacity, to the submission of the Piermont samples. It's such a story of what happens when you allow the state to weaken and management to collapse. However, having said that, John is the minister, and he carries the can for this, in my view. Because if that's not true, then the ANC can blame apartheid for unemployment today. The DA can blame the ANC for the state of the country. If it one day governs, we'll never get any. John has the responsibility. And in this, I think there's a fork in the road here for him. If this thing does not come right, the following is probably going to happen. The ANC will be able to campaign and say, look here, we started this unity government thing. We gave the DA a chunk of the economy to manage, the agricultural chunk, which is very important. They sent their top guy to do it. And 3 years later, everything is dead. The domestic market is wrecked. Banks are in distress. Businesses are collapsing. Do you really want these people to govern any more of the country? Or can we go back to the way things were? So there's a real risk for John and the fairly or unfairly. You can argue that, but this is the reality of the thing. There's also further risk to the DA and its domestic and global reputation. That if this goes as badly wrong as the worst case scenarios that I've sketched for you suggest, there will be no escaping the sense that the DA is broadly not an alternative to govern South Africa, because the costs will be so very high. The anger of people, the people who understand cattle and bird have an attachment to the animals. They care about them. The suffering is unimaginable of these animals. Imagine if much of that rural wealth base dies. What are people going to think about John and the DA after that? Because they will be blamed for it, and they will blame them. And therefore, there's a flip side to it. John can say, look, this is what I signed up for, and this is what I inherited, but we fixed it. And the way to do that, I think now, we don't have time to this way or that way, is to say, here's the deregulation. The state has lost control. The idea of it being a state-controlled disease is very much in name only now. And South Africa has an amazingly resilient and entrepreneurial private sector. And I want them to come up with a solution for me and tell me what regulatory hurdles need to be cleared out of the way to do that. And I think if he does that, there is an even chance that he can start to beat this thing and then turn it from a disaster to a triumph. But my sense is that will now have to be done, and it's going to take very forceful leadership. Remember that the ANC and the DA are partners in the government, but they also have interests in each other's demise. There will be many people around the ANC ranks and around the cabinet table who would delight in seeing this thing turn out. I mean, they'd worry about the consequences too, but politically delight in seeing this fail horrifically, in order that the DA never has a claim again to saying that it can do a better job of governing South Africa than the ANC can. So I think he's at a fork in the road here, Gabriel.
James, last comment or question, because we do need to move on to the next segment, but to you?
To what degree is John in control of his department? I mean, is he in office but not in power? I mean, can he actually get anything done?
That's been put to me. I mean, he is the minister. Minister has certain powers. He is half of the government, and he has leverage. And I mean, you can make a technical argument. You can amend regulations. You can make a political argument about the use of power. This is the opportunity to do exactly that. And I think if power is applied in a sophisticated and correct manner, then absolutely he can get away with the success here. And also with Mr. Ramaphosa, you must remember, it's also a cattle guy, Ramaphosa. he has a deep affection for cattle. People who speak to him say that if you talk to him about the country, he looks quite sad and withdrawn. But when you talk to him about his cattle, he lights up. And so I think John and Ramaphosa could form a very formidable team here to beat this thing. Can be done. It's just a question of taking the right regulatory decision now. Then we've got a chance.
So we're going to continue, we're going to move away from the disaster that is foot and mouth disease and try to give the ladies and gentlemen a palate cleanser in which they can see that although there is bad in the world, there is also certainly good. And out of disaster often comes opportunity, because Simon, you're going to be telling us about some growth opportunities that are existing in Africa due to the kerfuffle between the United States and Europe.
Yes, this is the study in a few parts. And it started in London toward the end of last year when we discussed on the show the either intentional or unintentional dismantling of the fintech entrepreneur environment. And that was captured by the departure of the CEO of Challenger Bank Revolut, has left to Dubai. And a number of other smaller advisories and VCs have also gone to Europe. And so we're looking at an economy in the UK. And it's interesting because this is almost a tangential to mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, which is the other thing that that gets cows apart from foot and mouth. And you know, when you ask the Treasury, as we did last year, about growth and where's it going to come from, you know, they send you financially illiterate answers such as, well, just look at the performance of sterling against the euro and the dollar, or even this week, just look at what we've done with the renewable energy auctions, which they've got the maths completely arse over face about. So we're looking around toward the end of last year and going, well, you know what, I think that the danger investors run into is expecting growth when there genuinely seems to be a absence of prospects. And the people that are running the show don't know what's going on. So let's cast our mind a little bit elsewhere to see what's happening in other markets. Now, around this time, there's a little bit of gentle saber rattling between the EU and Trump, and that takes the form of tariffs, but it also takes the form of public sentiment and this continuation of NATO. And the net result of that is that the European nations, member states, are going to have to spend a lot more on defense, and subsequently pensioners in France can't retire at the ages that they want to, and countries like Sweden are going to have to claw back at their welfare apparatus. Now, in addition to defense spending in flatlining or moribund economies, is the fact that you have to establish new commercial deals. You need to reach out. And so we go to the end of last year where we see the G20 in Johannesburg, and we notice incredible warmth in the tone of the diplomats attending, and a lot of the ministers had lovely things to say. And we haven't heard European diplomats talking about South Africa like that for a very long time. And so we're looking at Africa now. We go into from one place where that there is very little noticeable growth to a place where we haven't really spent too much time studying, but we notice two pretty incredible things happening. The infrastructure development in West Africa, and that is largely being spearheaded by the Africhem Bank. It's got an X in it, I don't know, Africhem Bank, which was founded in 1993 and it's an amazing story, headquartered in Cairo, and it was established to as a lender and to control the continent's dependency upon external creditors. And we've seen what they've been doing, and we see the work that Africa's richest man, Ali Dangote, has been doing with him and his family. And we see the work that they've been doing in pretty obscure jurisdictions and pretty obscure industries, such as the veneer industry in Gabon. And that particular bank has an ambition of 250 billion assets under its control in a decade, and thereafter beyond. And we're going, well, this is very interesting. And we look at places like Ethiopia and investment into infrastructure moving from West Africa, and we're looking at the government tenders that they are releasing and the interest levels. Then we move to East Africa. Now, very interestingly, this is probably the start of something that could rival some of the great resorts in the world one day. Last year, the largest hospitality group in the world, which is US-based Marriott, announced plans to develop the east coast of Africa, Kenya, Tanzania. 10 years ago, you would have said to these people that had these ambitions, look out, you're going into a frontier market, count the fingers on your hand after you've met with these guys. And that is not the case at all. And any concern that was raised at the Future of Hospitality conference that was held in Cape Town last year, any concern was met with the previously successful, demonstrably successful track record in places like Mexico. Now, if you look at a place like Cabo San Lucas, which is in the California Baja Peninsula, at the tip of the California Baja Peninsula, say, well, that was probably also once a pretty rough market. You're dealing with the locals there, not easy. What it has become in the space of a decade is truly remarkable. I was there about 12 months ago, and that ambition is now being carried forth into East Africa, but not just on the coast. They've got plans to go into safaris and other leisure stuff. So what I'm trying to get at here, Gabriel, is that there is a noticeable shift in attitude toward growth in Africa. In London, places are creaking. It's not as optimistic, it's not as encouraging, and all the data reflects that. It doesn't help when you have ministers who are openly financially illiterate on social media platforms. In Africa, there does appear to be an urge that is outside of the continent's own ambitions, and that is these commercial agreements that Europeans and Americans, also not just Europeans, are going to have to forge with the continent. And that puts us in a position to predict that as a result of the EU's saber rattling with Trump, as a result of this desire to seek new opportunities because your economy depends on it, we are probably going to see an increase of a significant increase, possibly 200% of foreign direct investment into South Africa in 2026 and other economies. And so for people who hate Donald Trump, you're more than entitled to, but when the money starts coming in, just remember that it came in as a result of what he was doing. So we're very bullish on this year and the years moving forward. Obviously, one has to always caution any enthusiasm for the presence of the Chinese over 2 decades now, which has almost reached stabilization point as it relates to a presence here. Everything is pretty much in their supply chains already, and it's obviously not universally popular. But we're anticipating there to be a real drive in American firms and European firms, particularly in West, East and Southern Africa this year and onward. And I'm sure France would probably agree with those points.
Yeah, so Simon, I just want to quickly chat to you about one thing you said there. When you said that you think there might be something like up to a 200% increase in South Africa, do you mean in South, or was that Southern Africa generally?
Our FDI has sort of plateaued around, I think, about $1 billion for the longest time, and that was obviously given a shot in the arm by the share deal between Prosus and Naspers. But now we're probably looking at a much more consistent growth without the spikes, as a result of what's happening in terms of how firms are thinking about expansion or entering new markets.
Then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, so you mentioned now the kind of East and West Africa, this Afrix bank, how they want to put, you said $250 billion worth of assets. Is that primarily in the rollout of infrastructure? And if so, like what infrastructure are they rolling out and where's it generally going?
Well, it's a blend of infrastructure and industry, and what you're probably looking at more is oil refineries and industrial plants, more than anything else. No telecoms, as far as I'm concerned, although there are sort of random projects involved, but it's mainly into industrial infrastructure upgrading, new developments, as well as so a lot of oil, a lot of gas, and I think that's probably going to lead the way for them to look at more alternative opportunities eventually.
Great. Thank you, Simon. I think, we'll take another an opportunity at another point to continue this theme of where the kind of opportunities in Africa are, but we do need to keep rolling out a bit of a clip through the last few stories. James, we're now off to you to continue on the good news, because the German chancellor has kind of started to maybe walk back on some of their climate change craziness.
Yeah, I mean this effort to pursue net zero in Europe, also Britain, but Germany has turned into a total debacle essentially. Germany, and along with the UK, I think has the highest almost the highest residential electricity prices in the world, which is and it's if they don't course correct, they're going to deindustrialize Europe and Germany completely. And the amazing thing is, despite these prices being the highest in the world, the government still has to subsidize them. So under Merkel, there was this lunatic plan to completely close all the nuclear power stations in Europe, which was then followed when the Russians invaded Ukraine. They then moved. There were still 3 nuclear power stations operating, but the Greens were in government. The Russian supply of gas was going to get cut off, and they insisted on still closing the nuclear power stations. So that left Germany dependent on wind and solar energy to an extreme degree. And the problem with that is it's intermittent. It's very expensive to get the energy into the grid. So the network costs are absolutely insane. And then you need another form of energy in order to compensate when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. So the Germans, the previous government, then implemented another completely mad policy, which was that the power should be provided by so-called green hydrogen, which is a completely uneconomic and fantastically expensive form of energy, and would take a huge amount of time to build. And it takes energy to generate green hydrogen. It's not actually a form of energy. So Merz, the Germans now seem to have if they're not going to wipe out the entire economy, they have to shift away from this very quickly. And so now Merz and the government are sort of on the verge of building gas-fired power stations, which can then be retrofitted for this lunatic green hydrogen initiative. But you can start generating start generating electricity relatively quickly with these gas-fired power stations, which can, the point he made in his speech is they can be built on existing sites, they can fit into the existing gas network, which apparently the previous government didn't want to do. So he made this admission in the speech in Dessau recently, where he, to quote him, I mean, I want to say here, it's almost trivial, but I want to say it again. If you're going to phase out nuclear energy, you should have at least have left the last remaining nuclear power plants in Germany online 3 years ago, so that we at least have the electricity generation capacity that we had at the time. As it is, we are now undertaking the most expensive energy transition in the world. I don't know of any other country that is making it as difficult and as expensive as Germany. We have taken on something that we now have to correct, and we want to do it quickly and better. The power stations, these are the gas power stations, should be built. So they're just waiting for approval from the EU, and then they're going to push ahead with that. And obviously this is relevant to South Africa because the Europeans have been, apart from destroying their own economies, they now want to try and destroy South Africa's economy by pushing this stuff on South Africa as well, getting the country to close its coal power plants, which the economy is totally dependent on. And they offer a lot of money, but the European example is it's very expensive, and at the end of it, you don't have electricity, enough power, and you are paying absolutely sky high rates for that. So this idea that you transition to renewables, it'll be cheaper, has been totally debunked by the European experience. So if Germany's sort of trying to move away from it, hopefully in time, I don't know if it is in time, South Africa should really pay great attention to what is happening in Europe, and not allow this lunacy to be foisted on South Africa as well.
Simon?
Yeah, I've just got one question for James regarding Merkel's decision. Was that prompted by the Fukushima nuclear power with the tsunami in 2011? Did she ever base her decision to shutter those plants on that?
Yeah, that was the sort of opportunity, I suppose. In that moment of panic, you could push through a decision that otherwise would have, I think, been fought off. And the Greens in Europe have been fighting against nuclear power forever, and the rumor's always been that they were sponsored by the Russians. To do so, because then Europe remained heavily dependent on Russian gas. Yeah.
Frans?
Why you think Germans were sort of learned, educated people, and at the time that these decisions were made, no serious observer thought that this would work at all. I mean, a lot of people said it would work, but they're not serious observers. And ideas like green hydrogen, it just doesn't work, and it's plainly obvious. How does it happen that a sophisticated country of technology, of science, of learning makes decisions that are so cripplingly bad? And more than that, even if you say it's slightly ideological and whatever, the rise of hard right politics in Europe can be linked directly to increased energy prices. So you can't even say it's something to shore up the relative left, because you ended up shoring up the right. How, James?
There are these mind viruses that sort of seem to be taking hold in the West. And what the explanation for that is, I don't know. But it's one bad... is a sort of an entire elite falling for one obviously bad decision after another. But I don't have the full answer to that. Maybe technology, maybe the West's adversaries being able to manipulate the sort of opportunities provided by these new forms of technology and information flow to manipulate the elites into these terribly self-harming policies. But that's just pure speculation.
There's a
Simon, and then back to you, Frans.
Yeah, I think just on James's point there, really worthwhile exercise to understand in a live application would be to go to the announcement made earlier this week by the UK government on the wind auction, the offshore wind auction that they've approved, and to see just in the correspondence and the critiques, and go to visit the business websites and the business media, and just to see how the reasonable, sensible people France was talking about how they've responded. Because firstly, the maths is all wrong. And secondly, again, to James's point, sometimes the wind doesn't blow. And what are you going to do? You're going to be left with multiple situations like Madrid experienced, or rather half of Spain experienced last year, when there's just too much renewable energy in the grid. And I see it happening in real time. I can assure you that one of the principal rises of a party like Reform, but not even the party, just the anti-establishment sentiment that prevails in the UK, has the country's energy policies, particularly net zero, firmly in its sights.
I'll suggest an answer to my own question, which is that in the West, because it's so difficult, you ask this question and no one has an answer. The Western world became so rich and comfortable and safe and happy, and the standard of living was so high. You were always well fed and warm and safe, and there's nothing more you could want, except for one thing, which is to be seen as increasingly virtuous. I mean, you couldn't have more nourishment or more entertainment or more safety. And so a race starts in the Western world to pursue the most virtuous possible idea. And so manufactured is that the world will end, it will melt, and therefore I will save the world by confronting the supposed origins of that. And that becomes a race. So I'll do even more than you. The next step was we'll turn off all our power stations. We'll have no power. We'll go and live in the snow. We'll suffer in shivering through the winter in order to show how virtuous we are and that we are saving the world. And I think that explains the virus. And it's, we'll do it in another show, but the theory is this might be the end of capitalism. This is how it ends. With such abundance of comfort and wealth and happiness and security that people believe that they can act against they're so safe they can even take actions against their own interests and remain safe, which they can't. But that's how the capitalist order and the Western order ultimately kind of collapses in on itself.
So I've just got a brief story that I think spells out what you're saying there, Frans, entirely, which was I had someone I knew had the pleasure of speaking to a very wealthy German, the wife of a very wealthy German who was spending 3 months in Cape Town. And they were talking about the state of South Africa and how much they loved it. And the wife made the comment that she was surprised how serious the country was taking the climate change issue, because for a few hours every day, they would turn the electricity off in order to cut down on their emissions, she assumed.
And, I'd have no problem with the Germans doing this to themselves. Although James would suffer, and I'd feel bad about that. But
I am suffering, I assure you.
Well, I do feel bad for you, James. However, what I do think is wrong is that they come to places like South Africa and tell us to do the same thing, and thereby condemn millions of people to a life of poverty. that's the offensive side of it. If you do it yourself, that's fine. But to do it to others is really a bit much.
Yeah, I think we're going to stay on the theme of the kind of mind viruses of the Western elite, and we'll go back to you, James, because another kind on the opposite end of Mertz starting to see some sense on the green policy, we now have this huge debate breaking out around ICE in the United States and what happened in Minnesota. So can you just tell us what's going on and what has been the response to it?
Sure. I mean, the background is again another mind virus, which was that under the Biden administration, they completely dismantled anti-immigration enforcement in America and allowed people to just cross the border in their millions without any vetting, which meant that all the people could be criminals or spies or agents of foreign powers and were just waved through into America in their millions. And this obviously massively contributed to Trump's election victory. And he came into power with a sort of commitment to get rid of I think he literally put it in his manifesto, a sort of mass deportation program. They've put a lot of money into ICE, which is the Internal Immigration Enforcement Agency in America. It's sort of, and then but you still have these democratic controlled cities in America, which it's quite sort of bizarre reading about it from a sort of foreign perspective. You'll have these people enter the country illegally, are criminals, commit crimes, get convicted, get sent to jail, and then under these sanctuary city policies or sanctuary state policies, the state or the city governments refuse to the state governments then refuse to hand over the criminals to ICE for deportation, and they are just released back into the communities. And this has led to this crisis in Minneapolis and Minnesota, where related to another story, there's been apparently massive fraud committed by elements within the Somali community there, which was exposed recently. I mean, and that's corruption, stealing federal funds on a industrial scale, which makes entrepreneurship in South Africa appear sort of, sort of a minor issue. And in response to that, I think Trump sort of provocatively then sent ICE into Minneapolis to start, collecting many of these convicted criminals who had been released into the community. And what ICE, the head of the ICE have said is, look, if we have to pick up the criminals in the community, if we find illegal immigrants there, we're obliged to arrest them as well. And then on the other side, you have sort of left-wing agitators trying to impede and block ICE, and it led to this tragic killing of this woman by an ICE officer, which was the result of this escalating situation where he thought she was about to run him over, and he fired and he killed her. And that obviously then led to even more outrage, more protests, and so on. So that now is the situation in Minnesota. The Trump administration's absolutely not backing down. And in Minneapolis, of course, was where the George Floyd died, and which led to all those rioting in 2020. And the Trump administration is not going to this time is not backing down. It's surging more troops, more ICE agents into Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, after the George Floyd killing, they refused to stand by the cop who was blamed, Derek Chauvin, and that led to an exodus of police from the Minneapolis Police Department. So Minneapolis no longer has police. And the further thing is, because of these sanctuary policies, the police aren't allowed to act as a sort of defensive line between the protesters and ICE. So they are just so it's sort of this anarchic sort of situation going on in the city.
Simon?
If you look at what's happening in Minneapolis under the mayorship of that guy, Jacob Frye, it's almost the example of where, you know, the countries that are going to the right across Europe, and America's gone to the right, and Argentina, and now Chile, and potentially other places. And these cities see themselves as like these bastions of liberalism. And it's the same in the UK, you know, and everyone else is voting for the Conservatives. You find the metropolitan places being swamped by you know, people who subscribe to these liberal principles. So I think it's a very interesting case in point unraveling at the moment, watching Jacob Frye say things in front of his police chief as he did last night. Like, oh, well, a lot of citizens in this country want the police to fight ICE in the streets. And then the police chief's face just like, it's not going to happen. So, yeah, I just think it's an interesting parallel.
The polls on it in America I looked at show on the shooting of that woman showed this just complete Western divide, where liberal, kind of more urban observers are en masse murder, and the right of the spectrum, the sort of more rural Republican supporting of, to a very great extent, saying that officer's life was in danger and he acted in self-defense. It's an absolute divide.
Yeah, I think that on that kind of more somber note about the state of the United States, we will move on to have a quick pit stop in global oil before we end with a couple of stories about the ANC. So, Frans, can you just tell us what the global oil outlook is looking like, especially given what your favorite, what your claim to be favorite president has done in Venezuela and intends on doing with the Venezuelan oil industry? What is going to happen this year with oil?
Yeah, and favorite president or not, I'm not sure, but certainly someone who's taken some very, very important strategic decisions that are to the benefit of the world. And one of those is decisions on energy policy and turning against some of the green ideology has allowed production levels to increase sharply of American energy. And new exploration and expansion, including into places that the former administration there said should not be touched. And the one of the effects of this has been a very sharp drop in global oil prices, which are down markedly over the year. At the same time, the American administration has an interest in engineering further weakness in the dollar, and they've achieved that to a considerable extent. The net effect of the two trends, the dollar weakness and oil prices coming off, is that global energy prices are coming way off, and that is to the collective advantage of sort of all the people of the world. South Africa draws a huge advantage from this. You won't hear that from South African policymakers. But in the South African energy price and fuel prices coming down, the effect of that is to create a little bit of breathing room around consumers and expenditure and economic growth here at a very important time for the country's government and the ANC. And in our sort of longer term global projections, if I do a briefing on sort of geopolitical world outlook, one of the trends we lean on now very heavily is that Trump turned against the global green ideology, and as a consequence of that, global energy prices are coming sharply off and that will be a contagious turn to some extent against the ideology, which means that we would urge clients to start factoring in lower global energy prices for longer at odds with trend lines of the past decade or 15 years.
Frans, one point is I did not mean to insist that you think he's your favorite president. I meant to insist that the internet seems to think he's your favorite president. But we're going to talk about we're going to move away from the global outlook and now end on narrowing our focus back into South Africa, where we have a couple of stories that I think are incredibly linked to each other. They're both about the ANC. So the ANC celebrated its birthday on the 8th of January. Happy birthday to them. But at the same time, across almost every key constituency, they are polling below 50%. So, Frans, can you tell us what the January 8th statement shows and why this might even be related to these terrible polling numbers that they're seeing?
Well, let's start with the latest numbers. I'll prove to you I can be brief. Data out from the Social Research Foundation late last year says that the ANC has now fallen under 50%, not just amongst the wealthy and the middle classes, but amongst rural voters, black voters, township voters, and the poorest voters, people who earn less than 2,000 Rand a month. And put differently, if the only people in South Africa who were allowed to vote were black, rural and township dwellers earning less than 2,000 Rand a month, the ANC would also lose an election. That's a pretty kind of situation for them to have gotten themselves into.
I think there's probably a relationship to how the January 8th statement seems to be a much ado about nothing.
The ANC's established its birthday is January the 8th, so every year it puts out the statement. The January 8th statement is a very useful thing because they kind of tell you what they're thinking about the world and the country. So they've got these dire numbers on the one hand, and then this juxtaposition of the statement on the other. And the statement's diagnoses are quite good. The economy is failing, local government's falling apart, we're losing power. So those are the three kind of insights, and then they're quite good insights and absolutely correct. But then if you're an ANC person and you kind of want the ANC to kind of exist into the future, or if you are like I am, you realize that it's quite important that it does, so that there is a partner to work with for the middle classes to build a unity government around. The responses are alarming. On let's say the economy is fading, falling apart. There's no appreciation or even suggestion of the idea that policy design might be the reason for that. Instead, what the statement blames is anti-transformation forces and says that these must be fought. On the question of let's say the next election, the ANC says our supporters are leaving, they're deserting us in all sorts of different directions. And there's no appreciation or acknowledgement that it's the material circumstances of those supporters that have caused that, and therefore those must be addressed. Instead, the advice the ANC gives itself is, therefore, we must campaign a lot more effectively to convince them that they should stay. And what you can draw from that, I think, is the sense that even where the diagnosis from the party is correct, as it now often is, of the threats that face it, the strategy to confront those fails entirely, evades, it must be almost intentional, confronting the reasons why it has moved into such a weak position. And you would think that if that continues to be the thinking, then this is a party that's going to remain, find it very difficult to find its way back to the majority that it once enjoyed. Worse than that, your worst case scenario for the ANC, after Ramaphosa goes at the end of 2027, if it doesn't get a compelling leader, these trends accelerate, let alone get a populist leader. No, you could easily now think through a situation where the ANC's vote share falls very quickly. And my concern in that and I think this is a concern that should be shared even by people who might not feel much for the ANC, is the DA is essentially a party of the sort of lower and middle and top end of the middle classes. And to form a unity government, the DA needs a partner that represents the emerging or aspirant middle class. And if the ANC collapses, there's no guarantee that it will be possible to form a unity government with a national majority that represents, as this one does, the collective interests of both the established, even the lower ends, but the established middle classes and the aspirant middle classes. And then South Africa looks a bit difficult to maintain itself as a stable enough democratic unitary state. Gabriel?
Yeah, so I do want to get to a couple of questions before we wrap on the stuff that you've just talked about now with the ANC. And I want to frame this first question, and a theme that we have kind of kept running into in this podcast is that it seems as though the ANC has there's this duality that exists in the ANC, and the January 8th statement is just an extension of that, where they can diagnose the problem, but they cannot look and they kind of and then you will say that, you know, when you talk to serious ANC guys, they understand what kind of what should be done and whatever, but they're never able to actually pursue even a piecemeal strategy that is like, at least in one area we're focused and we're winning and we're doing the entirely correct thing. And then Benji at the beginning of this podcast spoke about, and you talked about the small kind of group of that controls our foreign policy, and how, you know, most of the ANC, when you talk to them, very serious, there's an issue, they're not, but can we start to maybe conclude that this current leadership of the ANC, despite its ability to recognize the problems that it faces, it just simply, there is no evidence to point to the fact that they actually will ever actually implement a real solution to the problems they face?
I think the fact that the problem is identified and acknowledged is a step in the right direction, and clearly diagnosed. There was a time, I can remember I've been doing this for a while, when there was denial that there was a problem at all. Now we admit there's a problem. And there was a time when even in private, people wouldn't countenance the solutions or even consider those. Now that has also changed. So I think it has moved in the right direction in those respects, but it hasn't moved to final action at all. And there's little sign that it rapidly will. And I think some of the reason for that now, if people ask me why is that, I think a lot of it is structural. The ANC is an organization, obviously, and it's governed by a board, and the board is its executive committee. And the executive committee, once all the hangers-on are added, have almost 100 people. And the 100 people are drawn from very different walks of life and have very different interests. A few good people, quite a few bad people, corrupt people, the ideological people. And the chairman of the board, Mr. Ramaphosa, won't take a firm decision. He's trying to find common ground and mutual understanding and consensus before we move ahead. So every meeting is adjourned to say, well, let's meet again and consider what to do. Quite at odds with what Mr. Mandela, of course, did after his release from prison, where he made his first economic policy statement before his party had had a policy conference, just because he knew what would come. The ANC, as a consequence of that, had a very successful first decade. High growth, doubled the number of people in jobs, saw its support rise, protest levels came off, eradicated the deficit, cut debt levels in half. You know, we were very that they had. So I think it's the structure, the management structure, exacerbated by the nature of the chairman, that they can't take a firm decision, and therefore they can see the problem, they can accept the problem, but they can't make a decision on the solution. And therefore it appears now every time you go into the field to test ANC support, there's been a little bit of further erosion.
I want to just on this, because James, you've contributed to these topics a number of times, and I'd kind of like to get your opinion about, the France has told us that the ANC has this structural issue. Like, how do you see it? And then do you see a world in which, if they were able to, say, get over the structural issues, there would be any interest in that actually advancing solutions that would require, a mass private entry across a number of different key economic areas?
I think there's also obviously an ideological problem that the sort of goals of the National Democratic Revolution, which is again emphasized in the speech, are seen as sort of sacrosanct, so you can never question them. And then, the danger is that, when you hit a crisis point, you then sort of go hell for leather to try and implement, to realize the sort of historic goals of the movement before you lose power, which is sort of what happened in Zimbabwe under Mugabe in the early 2000s. I think what Thabo Mbeki was very good at was he could always, he knew the ideology so well and the language so well that he could sort of frame things in a highly ideological way that allowed for some sort of a more sort of reformist approach, at least on economics. But I don't think, the ANC has that sort of person anymore. So it remains very ideologically hidebound. I suppose if the GNU started working well and economic growth started picking up sort of quite dramatically, then the ANC might think, well, let's leave the revolution, put it on pause at least. But yeah, I think it's very hard for them to act outside of the ideology, and the ideology says you must always be pursuing these goals, and if you don't pursue them, then you've sold out the revolution and whatever. So that's another factor apart from Ramaphosa's particular style of leadership.
Then just a question then that made me think of Frans. You're someone who's talked at length about Mbeki's legacy, but what do you make of that point that James raised of his ability to cast his the more reformist agenda in the ideological language, that in fact maybe there's this kind of lack of sophistication that exists where people understand, but they don't understand how to use the correct language to convince people that they aren't betraying the revolution, while at the same time they're actually just doing sensible things.
Yeah, look, I mean, you're nowhere near the caliber of people that were in command of either the ANC or the government 20 years ago anymore. That immediately, and then you need to be really, you need very high quality people to get out of the position the ANC is in now. Those aren't in abundant numbers. I also think, this idea that you've got to cast it in terms of the revolution, maybe that applies to some small internal constituencies. But broadly, the public is well beyond that. And on key elements of what might be seen as the revolution, the state directing economic activity, etc., the public, the voting public, and the ANC voting public have overtaken the party and would be open to reforms. I mean, this is explicit in all polling for years on South Africa. Would be open to reforms that the party leadership would regard as a violation of the sacred pact to enforce and secure the revolution. So in as far as we started with this idea that the ANC's foreign policy, South Africa's foreign policy is a function of historical loyalties. They must be understood as that. They can't do anything. That's it. And we were able to demonstrate that that's probably completely false most of the time. And this might be a useful place to wrap it then, and to say the idea that the ANC can't reform because the people are so invested in this dated revolution, that is absolutely false on the data. The private data that we hold is clearly what we release in public, of course, too, because there's such a lot, it's impractical to release it all into public. But also other data that's not ours, such as the ANC's own record, that when it was pragmatic and investment increased and growth, its support rose very quickly, a la the era of Mr. Mbeki. And when it started entertaining more aggressively ideas of expropriation, national health insurance, and the like, its support collapsed to the point that we've sketched now. We even in rural and township constituencies, it's below 50%. And so this dated notion of the necessity to pursue this revolution is about as useful to explain the positions the ANC takes as to say that the foreign policy is informed by historical loyalty to liberation era partners. Gabriel, that's it from me.
So I do think that is a great place to wrap as we end on a theme that we seem to start on, that in fact it is the poor decisions of a handful of people that limit South Africa from achieving the growth and the opportunities that we know that it can. So thank you very much to the ladies and gentlemen for tuning into this week's episode, and thank you so much to our wonderful panel for all of your contributions. Before you go away and forget about the Common Sense, ladies and gentlemen, remember that we also have a website, thecommonsense.co.za, where you can find stories ranging from politics to family to culture to sport, and make sure to tune in there until next week's episode. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.